Anyway, welcome, Jonathan. We appreciate you being here today and helping us out. This is a study I started because this time of year, many of the people around us are thinking about the first Epiphany of Jesus. And as your handouts have here, this is the second handout I turned out. Epiphany is a Greek word that means to show up, or to appear, to understand. So even in English, when you get an idea and it finally comes to you, you've had an epiphany. That was how it was spoken of in Greek. In the Latin, after Christianity was legalized, theologians got together to create a scriptures in Latin, and they used the word adventus, which today is Advent. And it really refers to the 4 Sundays before what everyone celebrates as the birth of Christ. We know he wasn't born in the winter, not with the shepherds out in the field, not with a census being taken. A good trivia question may come up next week. See if you pass the test. Why did Mary and Joseph go to Bethlehem? They lived in Nazareth. They were happy there. He had a job. He had a business. Had all their family there. Why did they go to Bethlehem? They went to be counted. Yeah, the emperor wanted a census, and the only reason for a census at that time was to know how much to charge people, set their budget. Worked for a church in Michigan one time where every year they wanted to count the membership and set up their budget. I said, wow, sounds like Mary and Joseph going to Bethlehem. But why would she? I always wondered why she had to travel riding on a donkey that far while pregnant. You know, friends of mine, we'd take them out horseback riding, and one friend of mine says, now I know why the cowboys are so tough. He's walking like this. I can imagine. And don't think for a moment that they were all alone on the road. That's how all the pictures are, aren't they? Try. Now, everyone for a census had to travel to their ancestral home where the records were kept. Joseph was from the house of David. So from the physical standpoint, Joseph was the father, and he traveled. And if his family lived in Nazareth, they traveled with them. You know, I'm not going to let my daughter go alone with this other guy, this scoundrel, and she's pregnant, ready to give birth. No, I'm going to be right there with him. Mary's family also probably went along. And if you take Luke's genealogy, which is different from Jesus to David than Matthew's, Matthew actually traced the lineage through Joseph. It's very possible. I'm leaning toward Luke's genealogy being that of Mary's.
I have a question. I've never thought about it, but I know Joseph knew that the baby wasn't his.
Right?
Did her family know that?
I doubt it. We're not told.
No, we're not.
But they were small town. Are there any secrets in a small town?
Not too many.
She went away to visit Elizabeth, stayed 3 months, because Elizabeth was 6 months already, so I got reprimanded for assuming that she stayed till the birth of the child, but what, did she have a job to come home to? She ran out of PTO? No, she would stay for the blessed event before coming back, and by the time she got back, she's 3 months pregnant. Joseph knew, it's not mine. She met somebody else while she was there. And he was going to do things quietly. That shows you his character, because that was a huge atrocity. And that's why the angel told him, and we're getting ahead to next week, I think, but this is why the angel told him, don't be afraid to take Mary as your wife. What's conceived in her is Holy Spirit. Oh, sure. Okay, I get it. That happens all the time, doesn't it? So there was a book written back many years ago, Two from Galilee, but it describes what it would have been like in first century small town. Everyone in town knowing you couldn't wait for the wedding. And why the people in Nazareth were so offended when Jesus pronounced himself as Messiah. What? Your parents are here. Your Children are, hey, who do you think you are? An illegitimate child? Conceived out of wedlock? You can see why Joseph would have been afraid to take her. So, yeah.
Nazareth is a low rent district.
Nazareth?
Yeah, because they said, can anything good come out?
Nazareth, actually, it'll come up in today's when we get there. It actually, the only good thing, good meaning God, about Messiah was that he was supposed to come from Judea. So when Nathanael asks the question, it was really a question of a faith that had believed the distortions. And like Saul of Tarsus had to go away for 13 years and unlearn and then relearn. And many times we have to do the same thing. A lot of what we have been taught isn't true. But no one challenges it for some reason. But that's what Nathanael was asking. Can anything from God come from Nazareth? Because the prophecies, like we talked about the past 2 weeks, the first day of Advent was hope, which is the prophecies. He was all supposed to come from the town of Bethlehem, town of David, city of David, in Judea. So that's where they were looking for Messiah, not from the northern territories. And the outskirts away from Judea were kind of looked down on as being lower class. Uneducated in the standpoint that they didn't get a high level of education. They were rough people. They were not what you would call the highbrow society. So that was what Nathanael was getting at, but we tend to get the competition into place. And there was a very ripe competition, according to the secular historians, between the northern Greek-influenced territory and that was one of the big fights in the church. The Hebraic Jews, those in Judea, were complaining against the Grecian widows. Or it was the other way around. The Grecian widows were not being allowed to participate in the work of the church. And the Hebraic Jews probably said, oh no, you're travelers from far away. You don't have to do anything. Sit right down there and we'll take care of it. And what you actually do is dismiss people from even serving. Don't do that. Someone gives you a gift, don't say, oh, you shouldn't have. Why not? And that's how I picture that taking place. But you already see a divide there, where the Hebraic Jews were complaining against the Grecian Jews, because the territory north of Judea was heavily influenced by the Greek culture. And that's what's coming up here. That ended up being a good thing. What I wanted to look at today is that Jesus' Epiphany, his first Epiphany, all in the scriptures, what we call the Old Testament. I've begun to call it the opening of the covenant. What we call New Testament, I call the concluding of the covenant. Because old means obsolete, and it's not obsolete. Yeah, if you don't have that, you don't have the basis for everything Jesus did and was. That first Epiphany, no one really had a concept for a second Epiphany until after he was ascended into heaven. Acts chapter 1, then the angel tells the disciples, yeah, quit looking up in the sky, get busy, get to work, because he's going to come back the same way he left. Spur of the moment, no warning. There he is. And Paul says there's no reason anybody should not be ready for it. There was no reason for the first one, yet how many people witnessed it? If God didn't put a star in a place where it wasn't supposed to be, there's some guys from the east wouldn't have shown up. If he didn't send if the angels couldn't keep quiet and just started into song with the shepherds, no one in town would have known what was happening. No, that's not going to happen the second time. So be ready and be working. He wants to find us working when he returns. So the second Epiphany is going to come when God determines it's ready and it's time. The first one was planned for very carefully. Told you all the prophecies. He had to fulfill some 300. You know, you can't get an exact number because a lot of prophecies were hidden in other scriptures. But he fulfilled every single one of them. And many of the prophecies he had no control over. Other people fulfilled them for him. So it was no coincidence. And they used those scriptures they had. At the end of the book of Acts, they used what they call law and prophets to prove Jesus was Messiah. Because that's what they spoke about. What we have in the New Testament just looks back at him. Reminders how to be like him. In between those two, though, is what we're looking at here. Because between Malachi and the birth of John the Baptist, not Jesus coming. Jesus was, I believe, 6 months later by the reckoning that is given to us. But the time period between Malachi, when he closed his words, promising John the Baptist, a prophet would come to herald in the Messiah, there was 400 some years. What they call 400 years of silence. But don't think the Hebrew and Greek word for silent is the same as English. It was very busy and it was very noisy. There was a lot of bad that was happening and a lot of good. But you can see how God was putting the final pieces into place to make the coming of Jesus, and this is where I want us to start today when we look here. It's Galatians chapter 4. The time period for Jesus' first Epiphany was the perfect time in history for the spread of a message across an entire empire, efficiently and quickly. God was putting things in place that would make it perfect timing. And this is what Paul says in Galatians chapter 4. He really ends chapter 3 talking about how we are sons of God if we're baptized into Christ. We are his, we are sons, we are heirs. We inherit. Inheritances do not have to be earned. They're granted. So is salvation. It's granted on the basis of our faith. So he mentions there in verse 4 that when the time had fully come, the perfect teleos, when it was matured, right to the ripest point in time, God sent his son, born of a woman, born under law, to redeem those under law, that we might receive the full rights of sons. The perfect timing for Jesus to come. You can read the rest of the verses there that you want to. But I think Paul was mentioning things that are put into place. 400 plus years of silence. In the Hebrew language, in their poetic literature, a lot of what we call apocalyptic literature is symbolic. Silence is symbolic of work being done. Even in the prophets, God did a certain thing and then he sat down. Okay, his work is done. Nothing more to do. Jesus on the cross, his last word. One word in Greek, 3 in English. It is finished. It's done. And he yielded up his spirit. But it wasn't quiet, was it? The earth shook. Veil in the temple tore. And a lot of people realize this guy, we made a big mistake here. Yeah. All right. But silence usually represents when work is finished. So when God concluded with Malachi, his servant, Malachi, if you want to pronounce his name that way, over in New York where we were, as a big Jewish community, and I knew some people named Malachi, and that's how he spelled it. So that's why I get there. Also knew guys named Levi. Sound familiar? They spell it Levi. I work with a guy now named Levi, and they every once in a while they'll call him Levi, because I told him the story of this kid. Anyway, all right, God had said everything that needed to be said. But there were still some last-minute preparations to make. That's why this is part B, different than the previous preparations, which were recorded by God's people. 400 years. The Bible has no information between Malachi and John the Baptist. But that doesn't mean nothing was happening and he wasn't working. He was there all along. It was just such an extended period of time that when the birth announcements came to Elizabeth, well, actually to Zechariah, Elizabeth believed it and didn't even, it appears she never got an angel visit. It was Zechariah who wouldn't believe it and couldn't talk. And no one had seen anything like that for 400 years. Longer than our country has been a nation. So that's quite different. And everybody sat up and took notice that we better watch this guy. This is something special. Yeah. All right. So that's why God took so long, was so that people would notice this is different. Yeah, but God was very busy putting the last things in place. I personally have just limited it to 5, just to understand why it was so perfect for the spread of the gospel. One was the group of Samaritans. And this goes back to Steve's first question earlier. You know who the Samaritans were? All right, the city of Jerusalem had been ransacked by the Assyrians. The temple had been destroyed. Those of any note or worth were taken away to Babylon. And this was the Assyrians. This was the culture at the time, what they would do. They believed that God was in charge of a geographic region. And those people were that God's servants. And the more powerful the God was, the more powerful the nation was. So when one nation defeated another one, their God was stronger than the other. So that's what it looked like when Jerusalem was ransacked. Everything the Jews put their faith in, the temple, the priests, their interpretation and traditions of the law of Moses, took that away. They had to start all over from scratch. They were taken away into time out. People from those regions that were conquered were actually resettled back in what is now Palestine. And you know that word comes from the Philistines. Those people have been fighting for 3,000 to 5,000 years. I don't think they're going to talk it over, shake hands, and, and give it up. Anyway, those peoples then that were resettled into the northern territory, not everybody was taken into captivity. The poor people, the peasants, they got the deal of a lifetime. All of the landowners and everybody else taken away. Here was land free for the taking. Houses they didn't have to build. Wells they didn't have to dig. Fields they didn't have to plow. Until it came planting season. So they were not real happy when the Jews returned from Babylonian exile. And what had happened is that the people who had been transplanted there, they intermarried with those that had been left behind. So they had mixed the race, and they had adopted some of their pagan rituals. So they mixed the religion. And when Ezra and Nehemiah and the others from Trans-Euphrates came back and found those people and seen what they had done, would have nothing to do with them. And it's unfortunate. I say very unfortunate. Because the Samaritan people, they really loved Jesus. Everywhere he went in their towns, they came out in droves. Jesus even used the Samaritan as the hero of one of his stories, didn't he? And that wasn't by mistake. Those people acted more like God's people than the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the others who had set themselves up to be the leaders. Jesus had great success, and so did the early church. But that was what caused one of the first fights in the church. The Samaritans and the Gentiles coming into play. Nazareth, Galilee, was an extremely heavily populated territory for the Samaritans. That's why they didn't like it. And to have Messiah come out of Samaritan territory was just like getting knifed in the back by the Jewish religious leaders. They could not handle that one bit. Yeah. If they had taken the time to find out where he was born, then they could have believed him. But like Nathaniel, he had to unlearn what he'd always been taught and relearn it the right way. Thankfully, he stayed with Jesus. And he believed. Yeah. The Samaritans, when they came to try to help rebuild with Ezra and Nehemiah, they were denounced and held at distance. And they were the ones then who rallied together with the other Gentiles in the area and opposed the building of the temple. You can read that in Nehemiah. 3 times they had to start building that before they finally finished it, because the Jews excluded the people that were there who really wanted to pitch in and help out. Let's keep that in mind today. The people that are not necessarily part of our group, they're still necessary and still important. They're still searching, and we can help them. Don't exclude them. Include everybody. Okay. But they were pretty much outside of the Jewish people. They were the first ones to really embrace Christianity. Philip had great success among the Samaritans. They were the ones who sent aid to the Jewish Christians too. All right. Soon after the return came the Greek period. Alexander the Great defeated the Persians, occupied the known world at the time, and what I hear is he was only in his early 30s. His generals really did all the work, but he was a master planner, a master tactician, and his army was supplied with the newest technology in warfare. At the age of, they claim, 32, he died. They found him face down in a puddle of water. I think he'd gotten into a drunken stupor. Why did he get that way? Well, yeah, he could. He had access. Basically, according to the rumors, his generals, his soldiers, they were tired of fighting. They wanted to go back home. He wasn't done yet. He got discouraged, got despondent. Well, after his death then, in 323 BC, the empire was divided between his 4 top generals. 2 of them come into play during this territory of what God calls the Promised Land. Ptolemy, his descendants were given northern Africa and the trade route through where Israel was and is. That's why it's called milk and honey, because looking at the land, there's nothing fruitful and fertile about it. I mean, you could graze sheep, but growing crops was really difficult there. But it was centrally located on all of the trade routes, whether or not you were going up into Europe or Asia or Africa, or you traveled through that territory. And so God planted his people there so that anybody going through would be influenced by his people. That, to God, was milk and honey. See, we don't look at it that way, do we? But that's why it was done. That's why the Ptolemies wanted it. North into what is now Turkey area, we had the Seleucids. And they were constantly going back and forth, seesawing back and forth, who was in control and who was in charge. You can see, if you were one of the residents of the land of Israel there, you can see why they so desperately wanted to get these people out of here and just leave us alone. Just a seesaw battle. The Ptolemies appreciated the Jewish people, allowed them their religion and everything else. The Seleucids couldn't stand them. So that was just a constant back and forth, back and forth, back and forth for hundreds of years. I give you the time period there, and those are not exact numbers. That's just what history allows us to guess. From 331 to 167 BC. The empire was, I got that. They constantly, but during one time, one of the Seleucid leaders named Antiochus, or Antiochus, however you want to pronounce it, thought he was all that in a bag of chips. Called himself Epiphanes, which means the Great One. The Jews hated this guy and called him Epiphanies, which was a breed of pigs. So, kind of used the word and kind of changed it around a little bit for him. But he was so anti-Jewish that he did the strike three and you're out thing. He and his soldiers cleared a path and went into the temple. Strike one. No Gentile was allowed in there. He offered a sacrifice to the Greek gods on the altar there. Strike two. He wasn't a priest, and those weren't real gods. You know what strike three was? Part of the name the Jews gave him was the animal that he offered. A pig. That was what they commonly offered in sacrifice to the pagan gods. So, a guy named Judas Bar Hasmon, son of Hasmon, he rallied the troops. That was it. The Jews were tired of this guy. He was the last straw that broke the camel's back. He got the troops rallied and drove off the Seleucids to the north. The Ptolemies stayed to the south. So they had their little window of peace and independence. Judas was nicknamed Maccabeus, the Hammer. Isn't that a cool name for a wrestler? Judas was Hasmonean, but that began what is known as the Maccabean period, from 167 to 63, just a little over 100 years. At that time, then, they purified and rededicated the temple. The Hebrew word for dedication is Chanukah. Sound familiar? Just a little over a week ago, they celebrated the Festival of Lights. They burned the candles in the Holy of Holies after it had been rededicated. They didn't necessarily have that much supplies, I guess. They just left them burning. They lasted 8 days. So now they have a menorah with 8 candles on it, and they light those one day at a time, just to remember rededication, Chanukah, of the temple. But it was not so impressive. Neither was the one they rebuilt when they came back from Babylon, because when it was all done, the older people who remembered Solomon's temple sat on the hillside and cried. As this looked like a cinder block hut compared to what Solomon put together. And they remembered the magnificence of Solomon's temple, and no presence of God visibly filled it. So when they rededicated this one, same thing. There was no cloud that covered the Holy of Holies, and that inner room was empty. Don't know what happened to the Ark of the Covenant until Indiana Jones in the late 1930s found it. And now it got incinerated at Roswell during one of the testings of the atom bomb. I've given away another film, haven't I? Sorry. That was George Lucas's way of getting it out of there, out of sight. But no one knows what happened to it. Vanished. The Jews enjoyed a brief period of independence and peace. The Greek influence cannot be under or overestimated. What the Greeks did during their time of occupation made perfect timing for Jesus' coming. Alexander, being schooled by Aristotle and Socrates, the great minds of his time, wanted to spread the Hellenista culture everywhere. And that's what the Greeks call themselves even today. When the Olympics were over in Athens and they had the speech by the people who were hosting it, you had the subtitles underneath. And every time they came to the word Greek, they said Hellenista. That's what they call their own culture. Alexander was determined to spread Hellenista to his full empire, and he did such a good job that is what influenced anyone outside of Judea, was the Hellenista. Again, competition and bad blood between the two. He established schools because schools were knowledge is power. If the people know what's going on, first of all, they'll join you and they'll behave. That was the philosophy of the day, and it worked. You fill them in on what's going on, people are fine. It's when you keep them in the dark that they get angry and start coming up with superstitious conspiracies. Art was established. Art was an expression, especially for people that didn't have a high level of education. They'd just paint a picture, and the picture told a story. Michelangelo painting the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel got in trouble so much because of what he painted. Yeah, he got in trouble for depicting God reaching down to man, because it was the church's philosophy and doctrine, the other way around. Anyway, their greatest benefit was their language. So that Paul and the other apostles could write a letter to a church in the farthest regions of the empire, and someone could read it and understand it, because Greek was the universal language in the first century, like English is today. I didn't realize this until working for the airlines, that FAA requires everyone from every country flying an airplane to speak English. And that's how Greek was in the first century. And the scriptures were translated then into Greek. It was called the Septuagint, because that was the Greek word for 70. Roman numeral LXX is what it's referred to as well. And that's what was used by the earliest translators into Latin and Greek, was the Greek scriptures. That's the scriptures Jesus and his apostles quoted from in the Bible. The Hebrews scriptures were locked up and kept from public view so that no one would desecrate them. And so they used the Greek scriptures. Well, in 63 then, the Italians decided, because the Hasmones were fighting, there was inner turmoil, there were murder attempts on the leadership. See what happens with men when you leave them alone? So Caligula stepped in and said, okay, I'll take charge here. And that was in 63 BC. The Roman period began for that territory. Of course, the Romans also saw it as a jewel because of the taxes they could charge and the fees and the tolls that they could charge the traveling salesmen in the marketplaces. So they seized the area, and they were not kind. Not just to the Jews, to anybody they conquered. They were vicious. They were cruel people. They invented ways of torturing people until the moment of death. That's what crucifixion was. It was a tool of execution, but the person was tortured to death before the body died. Yeah. All right. They massacred countless Jews for two reasons. One, the Jews refused to work on the Sabbath. To the Romans, you were subjected. You had a 7-day work week. You didn't get a day off. And the Jews refused to acknowledge and worship the emperor as the representative of the gods. So that was seen as a mark of treason. Treason is punishable by death. They got so tired of killing so many Jews that eventually the Jews were allowed to follow their own religion and conduct their own governmental affairs. They were the only ones in the Roman Empire because they were so obstinate in keeping Sabbath and in making sure that their God was just one God. They had gone into exile, a very humiliating experience, and it was not going to happen again. And that's when the Sanhedrin came into play. That was Jewish ruling council, and it still exists today. I used to deliver for FedEx over in Canton, Ohio. One of my deliveries was to members of the Sanhedrin over in Canton, Ohio. And I do remember a jeweler in town who was practicing some bad business. The government was going to threaten him. The FBI was searching. He didn't care. Who are you? Forget you. So they encouraged the members of the Sanhedrin that they knew. And that guy came on his knees begging forgiveness and paying back everything he owed. That's how strong an influence the Sanhedrin still has on Jewish people today. All right. The Herods were also put in charge. You can see on the back. Gave you a list of the Herods. This is from the Zondervan Handbook to the Bible, a resource I used as a textbook when I taught this at the college. But they came in under Pompey. Oh, I said Caligula, didn't I? Sorry, it's Pompey. He appointed a priest named Hyrcanus to rule Galilee, Samaria, Judea, and Perea. A priest? Ha! These guys were Idumean, which is what the Latins called the territory where the Edomites had settled. You know who Edom was? Esau. Yeah. The Romans thought, okay, we'll get someone from the family there to be in charge. What did the Jews descended from Jacob think of that? These were the guys that tried to prevent them from coming back from Egypt. They hated these guys. But these guys were opportunists, and they secured their position. And he had 2 sons in key position. You can read this here. Herod the Great, Phaziel was his name. He built the temple in order to please the Jews. They said, thank you, give us the keys and get out. But he pulled a fast one. This was the guy who was in power when Jesus was born. He had all the children killed in Bethlehem. And then died a very, very severe way afterwards. His kingdom then was divided among his sons. Archelaus, when Joseph found out, when he was in Egypt, he found out Archelaus was on the throne, said, ooh, I don't know if I want to go back there. And so the angel directed him in a roundabout way back to Galilee and went back home to family. Archelaus was even worse than Phaziel was. Herod Antipas was in charge of Galilee, northern territories. He was the one that executed John the Baptist, but he didn't do it because he wanted to. He did it because his niece danced for him, and he offered her mother's position. There shows you the immorality that took place in the higher-ups there. Yeah, he was the one that had John the Baptist executed. Philip took the territory of Iturea and Trachonitis up in the north. His wife didn't want to stay in the north. She wanted to be where the action was. So she left Philip and married Herod Antipas instead. And John the Baptist denounced them for that. Herod Agrippa took over after Philip's death. He was the one that executed James and imprisoned Peter. And Herod Agrippa is the one that heard Paul's defense. These Herods were in place. The Jews were allowed to have a high priest, but the Romans had to have a double agent involved in their meetings as well, just to prove that they weren't planning any revolt. What the Jews had to laugh under their breath about is the one that the Romans appointed was actually the son-in-law of the real high priest. So at the time of Jesus, he had 2. They arrested Jesus and first took him to Annas. Annas was the real high priest. But they couldn't execute anybody without Roman permission, so then they took him to Caiaphas, who was the son-in-law, but the double agent then. And then they could get him executed. The Roman influence as well was so important, you can't over or underestimate. They built a system of roads to transport their soldiers quickly back and forth, so it was safe, it was efficient, and it was policed. So a traveling missionary with his group could walk through the countryside. There were no borders to cross. They could have safe travel. There was free trade, so Paul could set up his shop, his business anywhere he wanted to, conduct business. The advanced government system actually afforded him many opportunities to preach the gospel in high places. But the Romans did not want revolt, and they realized that if people knew they were being treated justly, they behaved. We in our country follow a lot of the Roman government systems. Also, the engineering advancements had brought life to arid regions with their aqueducts, and so cities were built along rivers. And It became the perfect time to spread the gospel. The other two I'll go through real quick. You can study these on your own. The synagogue was established during the time of the Babylonian exile. It was where the common man could go for worship and Bible study, because in the temple, if you weren't from the tribe of Levi or a son of Aaron, you had no business being there, on pain of death. So they established the synagogue. The gathering together is what synagogue means. And it became the central part of Jewish life. It was the school. It was the inn for travelers. So Paul, that's why he went to the synagogue. Not necessarily to find religiously minded people, but he could get a bed for the night. Get something to eat. It was also the hospital for those who were sick. Paul had a lot of physical ailments going on. It was also the social security system for people who were down on their luck. And when people claimed Christianity, they were kicked out of the synagogue, which means they had nothing in life. They were totally excommunicated. So they had to travel, go somewhere else, or do without. And the different sects of religion. One of my students turned in a paper on the Jewish sects, but spelled it S-E-X. Don't do that. That's why I handed out this handout and spelled it correctly. Sect, section, groups. You had the traditionalists who wanted everybody to do everything the way they wanted it done, called Pharisees. We have those today? Don't answer. Sadducees, who thought they were all that in a bag of chips and they had the right to tell everybody what for. Point out everybody's faults. We have that today? Don't answer. We had the Herodians, who favored the Roman rule and adopted a lot of their traditions and their religion practices. Matthew was a tax collector. There were zealots who were going to win the throne for David through physical means, and they would kill anybody who stood in their way. One of Jesus' disciples was a zealot. I don't think Jesus paired him up with Matthew when they went out 2 by 2. That would have been a recipe for disaster there. The Essenes, who were the isolationists, thought everything everybody else was doing was wrong. They had to go out to the wilderness and clean everything up. So they wore what they could find in the wilderness. They ate what they could find in the wilderness. Bugs, locusts, and wild honey. Who does that sound like? John the Baptist. But they had safeguarded the scriptures in a cave that was found in the 1940s, still being studied today. They have all shed light on how many of our translations needed to be redone and improved. And we've been able to get a good glimpse. So I hope you can see there were more false messiahs at the time of Jesus than any other time in history. And that's because God had made the timing so perfect. Through the prophecies and through these last-minute pieces put into place, the gospel spread throughout the whole empire within one generation. Next week, we'll talk about this Advent, this Epiphany, the arrival of Jesus.